Now that we understand why it's important to check raise, it's time to start understanding how to check raise. First important thing to understand is that check raising ranges are built around your value hands. Now, depending on the board and situation, this could include hands like top pair, two pair sets, or flushes and straights and things like that. But value hands are always going to be heavily represented in your check raising range. They are the engine driving the check raising range. But the other type of hands that you check raise, the bluffs, are there for a reason as well. Now, PioSolver chooses 3 types of bluffs. It has good draws, it has bad draws, in which I include also backdoor draws, which sometimes just look like complete trash. So we'll call it trash. So we have good draws, we have trash or backdoors, and we have pairs. Now, most people when they're check raising, they just have one of these categories, just the draws. But actually each of the 3 categories, if you think of a war analogy, each one is like a different combat unit. So each one is suited to a different situation, and each one is there for a reason. And if it weren't there, you would be leaving one of your flanks unprotected. So what we're going to do in this video, and this is very key part of the course, is actually node lock PioSolver and start going through what would happen in terms of exploits if one or the other of the combat units were missing. Now, of course, check raising structures can and will change on various board textures. Something like 7-8-9 monotone or 7-8-9 two-tone is going to have a lot of draws to choose from compared to something like King 7 Deuce Rainbow. And the overall structure is going to have to adjust to that. Stack depth is going to change things, position is going to change things. But to start learning kind of what each of the 3 different bluffing categories is trying to do and why it's there, we'll start by looking at Queen 7-5 two-tone button versus big blind, picking this board because it has a little bit of everything, so it's a good board to learn and study from. And we'll start by node locking responses into PioSolver and seeing how the solver reacts. So kind of first situation with no node locking, Queen 7-5 two-tone, and we've seen this before. You have all of the 3 types. So good draws in this sense are going to be flush draws, open-ended straight draws. So flush draws like Jack 6 of clubs or King 6 of clubs, open-ended straight draws. Bad draws, stuff like on the one hand 8-9 off or 4-3 suited, but even more extreme would be stuff like King 8, A6, Jack 10, Jack 9. And you can see there are a lot of these, just backdoors pretty much. So overcard with a backdoor or backdoor straight, backdoor flush, stuff like this. We also have the pairs, very, very unintuitive hand type. Most people don't check raise these because they don't see why. Here we have stuff like 4-5 off, 6-5 off, 7-6 off, A7. Not even going to go into top pairs. I think those are more kind of merged value hands. But yeah, Queen 8 off as well is also in there. So if you go back to the classic strategy of check raising before computers, before solvers, it was check raise your strong hands and your draws. Now, even without looking at a computer, you can kind of understand the problem with this when you look at a board like King 7 Deuce Rainbow that doesn't really have any draws, or a 7-8-9 two-tone which has infinite draws. Just check raising all your draws or half of your draws is going to create a lot of chaos. We can look at this strategy on Queen 7-5 two-tone and kind of see the issues with it after doing a node lock. Here I've locked for check raising only draws. Now I still left like the merged top pairs in and tiny bit of backdoor stuff in, but if you look at all of these suited hands, they are all flush draws. We have all the open-ended straight draws. I'm leaving some of the gut shots in, but I made all the pairs disappear. 4, 5, 6, 5, 6, 7 are gone. All the trashy backdoor stuff, Jack 10, Jack 9, King 9, A6, all these hands are gone. So we're now looking at a check raising range that's mostly just value and draws with a little bit sprinkled in. This sim I have already run the node lock and seen how Villain responds, and just as a side note for people who want to recreate this at home, I node lock the check raise and I rerun the sim starting from after the check raise has already happened or after the c-bet has already happened. Because if I were to rerun from the root of the sim, the c-bet strategy itself would change, and that's not really what we're looking for. How to c-bet differently against someone who check raises in a certain way. It's more about how to respond to the check raise once it's already happened. So what happens if someone check raises? Like we said, only the draws. This is the response previously. Now keep these numbers in mind. 61% call, 3.5% 3-bet, 36% fold. Intuitively, and I'm going to give you guys this explanation before we see the result, draws are the strongest hand type. We're talking about good draws, so the check raising range is going to be very strong and very equity heavy. And that means to me that villain wants to probably 3-bet a lot more than this, or a bit more than this. And B, he probably gets to call less just because the range is very strong. So we're gonna run from this node, and you can instantly see the huge shift. So first off, it's kind of exactly as I was saying. So fold has gone way up. We're folding 59%. And this is going as extreme as just bet folding something like 9-7 of diamonds, or pocket pairs with no backdoors, even some pocket pairs with backdoors, and definitely something like even ace-king with a club, just straight up folds to the check raise. At the same time, we have twice as many 3-bets, with very often fast playing our value hands like queens and sevens and queen 7, because when we have those, our opponent likely just has a draw, so let's get more money in as soon as we can. If I were to summarize these adjustments, this is a very common player archetype, especially in live games, but also in online games. So if someone is check raising you with value and draws, the adjustment you need to make is not the most exciting, flashy red line adjustment, but it's the most effective adjustment. And that's going to be fast play or good hands, and just get out of the way, just fold a lot. It might feel like he's check raising you aggressively, it might feel like he's bluffing, but when someone's bluffing you with an open-ender or a flush draw, it's not really a bluff in the sense that his overall range stays really strong. All you need to do is, not really worry about folding, just don't worry about it. And here you can see, I guess, even the most extreme thing by PioSolver. PioSolver is actually folding top pairs to the check raise straight up on the flop. Now, you don't have to be this extreme, because in this simulation we know exactly the check raising range of our opponent, and in practice you won't. We're always slightly guessing. So you don't want to make very extreme adjustments. And if we go back to the original response to the check raise, which is this, you can see that here we were calling every ace-king with no backdoor. We were calling stuff like Jack-10 with a backdoor sometimes. All the pocket pairs. So I wouldn't go as far as folding something like top pair. This sim is just to show you the direction, and the direction is just be tight, don't worry about it. If it feels close, fold. If it feels marginal, fold. If you have something good, fast play, and that's it. Very easy exploit, very good way to defeat this type of check raising range. Next step is to say, okay, let's assume that villain has made this adjustment against us and is now really tightening up. What's the next natural evolution in terms of check raising ranges? There is a way to see this in PioSolver. You go to the check raise node and you look at compare actions, for example, comparing raising and calling. And we want to look at the hands that now have the highest EV check raising compared to check calling, considering that our opponent is A, fast playing his value hands after we check raise, and B, overfolding by a decent margin. So given the overfold, all the hands are going to make money check raising. But when we look at how much money they make raising compared to calling, you'll see something that, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. And that's that the hands that benefit the most from a big overfold plus higher 3-bet are just trashy hands. Remember we talked about these, right? Stuff like Jack-10, stuff like A6 or King-8. These are the hands that benefit the most. You can still check raise something like 6-4 suited, but 6-4 suited also does really well as a call. It doesn't really enjoy the big overfold as much as something like King-10. You're not as excited to get the fold when you check raise the open-ender or the flush draw. So even though these hands are still making money check raising, if you look at something like Jack-6 suited, the flush draw will make money, but these compared to calling will make more money. So the next exploitative adjustment against the guy who's overfolding all the time is to start check raising lots of backdoors, which, not surprisingly, is the second hand type that we were talking about. So let's look at a sim where we're doing this. I have locked the check raising range and actually removed almost all of the draws, and instead put in a bunch of A6, A4, A3 with a club, King 10, King 9, King 8, Jack 10, we have some King X of hearts this time rather than clubs. And still we left some top pairs, some draws, some stuff is in there. But overall this range is a lot more weighed towards check raising trash. And again, I want to run from this node after the check raise. Okay, so we have the check raise, and here you guys can see the exploitative response to the fact that we're now, rather than check raising our strongest bluffs, we're now check raising our weakest bluffs. And the response is quite the opposite of what it was before, because our check raising range now just got really weak. So how does our opponent adjust? He doesn't really 3-bet, because if he has something like top pair, top kicker, or 2-pair or a set, he actually wants our hands to improve and make a pair or make a backdoor draw, so we put more money in. So there's not much incentive to 3-bet given our bluffs are drawing dead against the top of his range. But what he can do a lot is just call us all the time, because we're check raising King 9, so why should villain fold King 10 or King Jack or Ace 9? And we see an incredible amount of calling. If your opponent is check raising you with value plus trashy backdoor stuff, you just get to call all the time, float him, and he will very often have to check fold on the turn in order to not get his frequency super crazy. And even when he does barrel, he won't have much equity, so bluff catching will be really, really nice for you. You can bluff catch very often with just pair blockers and stuff like that, because villain isn't drawing to an open-ended straight flush draw. He's just, drawing to a random pair that he won't even necessarily be able to value bet if he hits on the river. Now, an extension to what's going on here is that, say, villain check raised and checked the turn. You only want to stab for very small sizings, and in this sim we have 1/3, but actually you could go even smaller. And the reason is that villains his give-ups just have very low equity. They can't call even a very small bet. Whereas against the range with good draws, you would want to stab turn only with the biggish sizings, because draws can just call the small sizings. Here you get to stab really, really small, but this is just a minor thing. I think the main thing is the flop adjustment of someone check raises you only with trash, you just call a ton and let them play the turn out of position with trash. Good luck with that. Now, are there players who check raise you only with trash? I would tend to say not really. But there are boards where people check raise you only with trash, and if we go and think about something like King 7 Deuce Rainbow, the only bluffs available are trashy backdoors. So if someone's going value plus bluffs, and he does just a trashy backdoors, you guys now see the adjustment, which is to float a lot. And this is something that happens intuitively, because people just don't believe you on King 7 Deuce Rainbow. And if people float a lot, you want to add a lot of draws and pairs. You don't have draws, so you add pairs. So King 7 Deuce Rainbow is going to have a lot of pairs check raising, and hopefully now the reason is clear. Something similar happens on paired boards. If you look at something like 10-10-4, you're going to have lots of trashy draws, means you want to add lots of pairs, 4x deuces, 3s, 5s, 6s. All these hands are check raising because your opponent is going to be floating you a lot. If you look at some very, very wet board, like we were saying 7-8-9 or 10-8-6, where there are a lot of draws, if you made a check raising range that was only good draws, your opponent would 3-bet a lot and fold a lot, so you still want to add some trashy draws. What would PO Solver do against someone who's floating all the time? What is now the best check raise bluff? Take a minute to think what it's going to be. The writing's on the wall. We talked about 3 types, but see why it makes sense for this to actually be the 3rd type, and we'll see how the solver shows this. So, compare actions, raise versus call. Given villain now adjusted by calling all the time, we don't really want to check raise bluff with trash. Something like King 10 is doing a lot better calling than check raising into a range that doesn't fold. That doesn't make any sense. Similar with weak draws like 9-8 or the 4-3 gut shots. Of course, strong draws start looking pretty nice because these are now just value bets. They start being ahead of the range, they're not getting 3-bet, they get to barrel into a very weak range, which is very nice for draws. But another hand type that looks really, really nice for check raising once villain is calling you all the time is just having a random pair. And if you guys remember 6-7 offsuit check raising, 6-7 off loves check raising if your opponent is just gonna float you with random trash, right? You get some protection, you just get value. You're just check raising 7-6 to get called by king high and ace high and all these hands that you beat. So 6-7 actually starts generating EV as a check raise, a7 starts generating EV as a check raise, and these hands prefer raising over calling since they're forcing their opponent to put in money with lots of hands that are behind them. So strong draws for sure, as much as you can, but also just pairs. And specifically we're talking about middling pairs. You know, the really strong hands do very well calling as well. Middling pairs don't do too well calling. You know, you're going to be out of position for the entire hand. It's not a very exciting prospect. You would much rather have the initiative, get some folds, plus get called by worse is really amazing for these hands. So last sim we're going to look at is just for completion, even though we now have all the hand types. What if we check raise only value in weak pairs, which would look like this, right? Lots of these weak pairs getting check raised and not much else. If we're check raising only pairs, our opponent responds in this way. First of all, he does overfold compared to the balanced check raise range because we just have showdown value, so floating is not very effective against us. Second, he doesn't 3-bet very much because we don't have draws really, so like there's no rush. Again, his value hands wouldn't mind us improving. So kind of an in-between adjustment. And similar to before, with villain overfolding to the only pairs, if we now wanted to see which are the best hands to check raise and started comparing actions between raising and calling, we would see all of our straight draws doing fairly well, all of our good draws because they love not getting 3-bet, and the overfold is not huge, and we also see the trash coming back in, again due to the overfold. We've kind of come full circle. Now, this is kind of a balance, right? We have a balance between these three units, and if you think about each opponent and board texture as kind of a Terran and an opposing army, you can try to fit your army to the Terran. You guys might have noticed that as I'm doing the node locks, the total check raise frequency shifts from roughly 16.5% to 12%. So first of all, what does it mean? Because I'm keeping the value range constant, but making the check raise amount drop, you actually get a value heavy check raising range, and this is going to influence the reaction. Now, there are a few reasons that I did this, but I do want to briefly address it since it's going to come up a few times throughout the course. So first of all, the reason to do this and part of the logic behind it is in practice, when you analyze large numbers of hands, 12% is much closer to the actual number that is being check raised. Most people check raise less than the solver because they're missing all the hand types. So I do think 12% is a more realistic representation of what's going on. It's also tough to hit the high percent number when you're doing only one hand type. You have to get very, very extreme. So I think 12% is much more realistic. The responses and the logic are still going to be similar and in the same direction. So just for completeness' sake, I will show you, for example, what happens when you lock the full percent of draws to keep the value to bluff ratio the same while only shifting the types. And just keep in mind 12% is more realistic in our courses. We're focusing on logic, but also connection to reality. So I do think looking at the responses to a 12% check raise range is actually more useful than looking at the 17% range. So here I have quickly node locked 16.5% check raise. You guys can see to do this, I actually have to have every single flush draw. I have to have almost every single gut shot and leave some leftover other stuff. It was actually really hard to reach this number, like you have to be a check raising machine. And what you see as the response is that there is an overfold and there's a very large 3-bet amount. Now, when we locked to 12%, what happened was that there was less 3-betting and more overfolding because we had less bluffs, the range was stronger. So the direction of the response is the same. Given people check raise too narrow, I would recommend you guys stick to what we have in the main part of the course where we talk about 12%. But just keep in mind everything I'm showing, even if the numbers don't match, I have double checked. It's the same idea, even with different numbers, just the responses become more extreme. So to kind of sum up, when I'm looking at a check raise, I'm going to look, first of all, think about my opponent and how he's going to react. Now, if I think this is a guy who's just going to believe me, I'm going to load up on my trash. If I think this is a guy who's going to not really believe me, I'm going to load up on draws and pairs as much as I can and reduce trash. And if I don't know, I'll just have all three, but I'll kind of have an idea of what each hand is doing there, and that makes me very comfortable to raise any one of them at any given situation.